This is episode 9 of the Considering Charlotte series, where 4 experts, sometimes 5, from the United Methodist Church get together and talk about different topics that are going to be before the plenary session of the General Conference next month. It's coming apace. And we have different people representing different positions. And if you've been with us before, you know how invaluable their experience is. I'm Jeffrey Rickman. I'm just happy to use this platform to facilitate this conversation, hopefully for the good, not just of the denomination as a whole, but especially of delegates. And so if you know of a delegate, please feel free to send this on to them. This particular episode is going to deal with the budget of the denomination. It's going through a very extreme cut, potentially. There's a recommendation from the GCFA, that's the General Council on Finance and Administration, as well as the connectional table. They together are representing I think, a 43% budget decrease. Our people can correct me on numbers. I'm not a particulars guy. I'm a big picture guy. But I do know it's being touted as the biggest budget reduction in the history of the denomination. So this is a big deal. We're going to be dealing with questions of, is the cut big enough? Why is this happening? Where's the cut maybe going to impact things the most versus the least? I don't know what directions we're going to go to. I've told each of the people on here today what questions I'm going to ask, but it's a big, big topic, so we can go lots of directions. So I can just speak from my perspective from when I was a United Methodist pastor. I remember there being long-term frustrations with the size of the budget and the fact that we could just never seem to get it down. A lot of people that were in my orbit or that I was in their orbit had general concerns about the size of a growing bureaucracy and local churches giving sometimes over 10% to support such a bureaucracy of their income. We'll see what remains after this, of course, and we don't have a crystal ball, but we're going to do our best to kind of sift through these topics and hopefully help you out. So with that in mind, Joe DiPaolo is a historian. He's published papers, actually, but he's not going to go back 100 years. He's just going to reconstruct kind of a short-term history of this conversation, the developments, and then we're going to go to Lonnie with some more textured history. So go ahead, Joe.
Sure. So the last time that the General Conference met in full in 2016, they passed a budget of $604 million for the next 4-year quadrennium. That actually represented an increase over the previous quadrennium and an increase over what the GCFNA at the time had proposed of 599 and change. Things have changed dramatically since then. And of course, as you mentioned, I think it was in February, the budget proposal was finalized, came out with a budget that is now down to, I think it's just under $347 million. So from $604 million to $347 million for the next quadrennium. And the main driver of that, of course, has been the loss of churches in the last 4 or 5 years. Most of them through disaffiliation, but also through closure. The denomination reports over 9,600 churches now no longer in existence that were in existence in 2019. That's about a 32% decrease in the number of churches in the U.S. So that's been a big, big driver of why this is happening, because those churches are the ones that support the budget. And it's worth noting that though we are a global church, the U.S. churches have supported something like 99% of the budget over the years. So with the loss of that many U.S. churches, you're looking at significant losses in income. So it's interesting that over the last several years, in November of 2020, the GCFA was estimating that perhaps there'd be a 20% reduction in the budget. Then in November of 2022, a year later, when only about 1,300 churches had disaffiliated, they proposed cuts down to about 373, almost 378 million, 374 million, a 38% reduction. 6 months later, they reduced it to 370 million, about 40% reduction. And now in March of 2024, down to $346.7 million. So a lot of that has been because the numbers of churches that have been closing and disaffiliating have been larger than people anticipated. This impacts all of the ministries. One last bit of background, there are 7 funds that make up the general budget. They are the World Service Fund, the Ministerial Education Fund, the Black College Fund, the Episcopal Fund, African University Fund, the General Administration Fund, and the Interdenominational Fund. All of them are facing cuts to various degrees, some more than others, and we'll get into some of those specifics in a few moments. But that at least gives you an idea of the general overview of what's happened in the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Joe. All right, so Lonnie, let's have a broader picture. You are our resident expert, and you have a busy day ahead. We thank you for spending your time with us right now. But what background do you think is useful in understanding the budget picture as it currently stands?
Well, I think it's important to know how the budget gets put together, the budget proposal gets put together for presentation to the General Conference. And mind you, the most important thing to remember is that the body of the church that establishes the budget is the General Conference. The proposal for the budget is presented to the General Conference by the General Council on Finance and Administration. But there was a really important change that was made in 2004 that has impacted how the church budget was composed for presentation to the General Conference that differed from how it was done before that. In 2004, the General Conference, as far as I know, for the first time, decided to discontinue one of the major general agencies of the church, and that was the General Council on Finance and Administration, General Council on Ministries. We can't ever do away with GCFA. But
right.
In any case, we discontinued the General Council on Ministries. And rather than leave a total vacuum there that represented the planning of the program of the church on a general basis, we created as sort of a substitute for it, it's not a one-to-one comparison there, but we created the connectional table. And the watchword for the decision to create the connectional table was that we were intentionally going to bring mission and money to the same table for planning purposes. And what we actually did then, and it's important, I guess, in the context of this conversation to know that Amy and I both were not only on the legislative committee that made this proposal to the General Conference, we were on the subcommittees and even the subcommittee of the subcommittee that came up with the legislation that did this work, discontinuing the Council on Ministries and creating the connectional table. We gave the connectional table the authority to make the presentation to the General Council on Finance and Administration of what the program budget of the church ought to be. And the General Council on Finance and Administration was required in that legislation to take this recommendation from the connectional table and include that in its presentation of the whole budget, which included then on top of the program part of the budget, the administrative and the episcopal part of the budget. So that's roughly how the budget gets put together. The connectional table and the General Council on Finance and Administration get together, and the Council on Finance Administration has the authority and the expertise, for that matter, to make estimates of what the giving potential of the churches is. And they have the visibility and to some limited degree, at least, even the control of what the reserve situation is of the church, which also then has a role to play in deciding what the expenditure level can be. And based on these data, the CT and GCFA come up with what the budget proposal ought to be. And that's what we'll be dealing with when we gather in Charlotte. It will be this combined expertise from these two bodies on what the church can spend and will likely expect to receive through the next quadrennial, beginning in January of 2025.
Yeah, and to kind of add to what Lonnie was saying, I like things in simpler terms sometimes, but basically, GCFA determines the size of the pie, and the connectional table determines the allocations of that. And so the connectional table is the body who's responsible for saying what size of the pie are you going to get, and which piece is going to be allocated to you. And the reason they do the connectional table has that role and responsibility is because they also do the evaluations of the programmatic work between general conferences. So general conference sets the direction of the program work, and then those boards that are elected to each of these agencies, they're the ones who sort of refine that direction. And the connectional table looks at all of it and says, are you moving in the direction that general conference asked you to within the amount of resources that you were designated to use? So within probably the last couple quadrennium plus, right? The boards and agencies have been working towards trying to find creative means of finding other sources of income rather than just looking at world service. And you'll begin to see that some of them have found other means of finding resources outside of world service. But again, General Conference is the body who sets the programmatic direction of the agencies and what they need to achieve. And then again, they have to figure out how to do that within the means of what they've been given. So as Lonnie was saying, both the General Council on Finance and Administration and Connectional Table have to work collaboratively in order to present a budget to General Conference. And again, this is a lot of work. However, General Conference can shift and change that in one vote, just like Joe was saying, right? GCFA and CT came together in 2016 and offered one budget. General Conference added 5 or 6 million just by saying, oh, this is so important that we need to take care of it now. And behind the scenes, the agencies and the connectional table and GCFA work together to try to say, okay, where can we sort of reallocate some of our funding to help this new vision and direction that General Conference may say we need to focus in on. And so I think they try really hard to figure out how do we shift and change some of these resources to go where it needs to go. It's a tricky and complex process, and it happens behind the scenes very quickly when General Conference moves in one direction or the other based upon where the body or where the spirit is moving that during that General Conference.
That happened, what Amy's talking about, the General Conference adding money, that happened in 2016. The proposal from those two agencies was for $5 million to the African Ministerial Fund, and the General Conference added another 5. So that came out 10 million instead of 5 at that time.
Yeah, one of the things I read for this conversation was an article by Taylor Watson Burton Edwards. It was entitled What's New for General Conference 2024. I think he meant to write 2020, Part 1, the budget. And he talked about how in 2016 there was actually a budget reduction that was recommended, but it actually ended up being a budget increase by a meager amount because of that. So let me ask a clarifying question real quick, Amy, because you clarified something for me that I had not understood before. GCFA just decides the size of the pie. What is the total number that we're going to project and ask for? And then connectional table determines the slices, the size of the slices, kind of, and who goes to them or who it goes to. So hypothetically, if the General Conference augments the budget and changes what is proposed, then afterwards, does the connectional table get to reslice the pieces as it sees fit, or Lonnie shook his head no. Does it get to?
The chances are that the General Conference delegates will be specific in what they want that additional funding for.
Precisely so.
So but if they say, go ahead, Lonnie.
No agency, no person, no power group has authority to reallocate money that's been allocated specifically to a certain fund by the general conference. You can't, the GCFA nor connectional table nor anybody else can move money, say, from what's been allocated to the General Board of Global Ministries to the General Board of Higher Education Ministry. They can't, nobody can do that.
Okay. I want to turn to Simon now. And before I ask you about finance questions, you just got off a plane from Ethiopia. I just thought it might be interesting to hear a report from you on what's going on the African continent. Is there anything that would be interesting to us or germane to our conversation here?
Maybe it won't relate directly to this conversation, but obviously it's part of the preparations for the upcoming general conference to see what are the people on the ground thinking about going forward. There are those who insist that they want to disaffiliate. There are those who are declaring that they've already disaffiliated, although they haven't followed any particular pathway, like small little churches dotted around some places. So, but everyone is now aware, you can see the uptick in terms of activity, connecting people, talking about general conference. Everyone is now alert that the general conference is around the corner. Of course, it's said that we continue to suffer in terms of getting visas for our people. We have the Nigerian situation, which is not very good at the moment. But generally, those are the things happening, but not maybe not directly to this conversation.
Okay. So that's all interesting. And I'm also thinking Ethiopia is in a state of civil war right now, right? Or am I wrong?
Some parts, no, not quite across some parts, but not that bad. I think they're trying to put things under control.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, you're a brave man going over there. All right. Well, the thing I wanted to ask you about is, obviously the budget directly ties to the local church through the askings or apportionments that are sent. And then the things that I've heard about the African United Methodist Church is that it doesn't pay nearly as much dollar-wise in apportionments to the general budget. And I wanted to hear you talk about that. But also, having spoken with some African United Methodists, it seems to me that conferences are much more aggressive in getting money from the local church than American conferences. In America, they give you your total dollar amount, and you can pay it monthly or you can pay it annually. And if you don't pay it, you might get a slap on the wrist, but it's really not too bad in most places. But I've talked with African United Methodists where there's an expectation that there's a weekly or monthly payment, and if there's not, there's big bad things happen. So I would just be interested in hearing you talk about that, and if you know at all if these changes in the budget will impact African local churches in any specific way. I haven't read anything about that, but that's a bunch of questions for you. You just answer the ones you want, and then I'll be happy.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I would say the cuts in the budget will definitely affect the African churches in one way or the other. I will touch on that. But generally, our collection of monies from our local churches, it differs from conference to conference. In some conferences, they use, for example, for the pastor salaries, they use a common pool system where a certain percentage is levied to the circuits or to the local churches. Something like 45% of their weekly collections is picked up by the annual conference. A smaller percentage is dropped at the district to take care of district work, but the bigger percentage goes to the annual conference. Then the greater part of it goes back to the local churches as salaries for pastors, which then tries to equalize what each pastor gets. So the more able local churches then subsidize the less able churches. That's one way of collecting. But of course, generally, there is an expectation by the annual conference to collect monies from the local churches that would support the work at the district level and the annual conference level. But of course, in terms of our connectional funding, what then goes to the general church, we haven't done that well. Our figures are very low, as you already know, in the budgets. What eventually gets to the general church as the connectional funding that is very low. We have not done very well. then when we then look at how I believe the cuts in the budgets will directly affect churches in central conferences, especially where projects are concerned and where ministry is concerned, where we have had support from GBGM for ministry and other projects like that. Obviously, that cut will have a downstream effect on central conferences. That's quite obvious. And the other issue that is directly related to central conferences is even the issue of the Episcopal Fund. I don't have the exact details how much that has been reduced or not reduced. But if reduced, obviously it has a direct impact on the 5 bishops, new bishops for Africa, which were passed in 2016, but have not been implemented. And speaking from the Central Committee on Central Conference Matters that I'm a member, there has been an issue about the budgets. And up to now, that committee has not announced this final recommendation. We have to hear it at the General Conference, because there was issue of budgets, and it was not going to be easy to offer the 5 bishops anymore. So that directly affects its Africa, because that's where Methodism is really growing in leaps and bounds, but there is no, it's not proportion in terms of the general superintendency. If you then compare the 2 blocks, for example, the United States and Africa, we only have 13 active bishops with a population of close to 6.5 million membership, and almost the same kind of population in America with 40 odd bishops, 46 or so bishops. There is a total, imbalance in there. But I'm saying, if the budget, the Episcopal Fund affects the allocation of those 5 bishops, obviously there's a negative impact on Africa, which we would have expected to get even more, because 5 was only the minimum. Actually, if we were to really do it as the proportion per membership, then we needed a lot more, like 20 new bishops for Africa, in order to have an equal, proportion in terms of the demographics of the congregations in Africa. So that's how I see as the direct impact of the reduction in the budgets. The projects, the ministry support, obviously it's going to take a knock because of those reductions. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all. And we'll come back to bishops in particular. I wanted to make sure that we covered that and those dynamics. So I wanted to go to a broader conversation before we got into the specifics of the different things at play on just what's at stake. But it occurs to me that it might be good for religious people to talk about the biblical foundation for connectional funding. And I don't know if it needs to go super deep, but my justification for apportionments and a denominational budget has always come from Acts of the Apostles, where it was clear that they shared not just authority, but they also shared monies with each other. And then Paul was known for taking that collection for the poor in 2 Corinthians, I believe he refers to it. But it seems clear that the true nature of the church is well, the Methodist word is connectional, but that we share and have a common pot, and that money has to do with that. The reason I bring that up is because our theology impacts or it should impact what we propose to do together. So as we're looking at what's at stake, and we hear Simon talking about how ministries are going to suffer. There are not going to be as many bishops as could be. There's not going to be as much mission as could be. What theologically do you think people should be reflecting on as they figure out if they're just going to adopt the GCFA recommendations, or if they're going to nickel and dime it, or if they're going to refuse to cut as much? What theologically is helpful for them to be reflecting on? I'm not asking anyone in particular, just any of the 4 of you. If you're thinking theologically, how would you urge delegates to think through these things?
I think the gift... Go ahead, Simon.
Okay. I just wanted to throw in something that is also two-pronged. It's not only what the delegates may think, but what also those contributing much more to the budget think, because the rhetoric is changing. There are a lot of voices that seem to be quite directly getting uncomfortable that we are contributing much more and we should have more say on what we are contributing, that kind of thing. So there's those kind of distortions that we also need to think about. But I was not going to talk on the theology of it. Go ahead, Amy. Just wanted to bring that so that maybe at some point we can comment also on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is pretty complex, right? When of course we talk about the theological reflection of it, how does God, our God of abundance, and I think that's where I've always seen some of the challenges in looking at both the budget and the ways in which we give and the ways we talk about connectional giving, because too often our churches and our culture and society continuously think about the scarcity of resources, right? And when we talk about the scarcity of resources, then we are more than likely willing and or apt to hold on to what little we think we have. And I remember that when we were both talking at the connectional table and even in the work that I did with the General Board of Global Ministries, it was how do we begin to help people think about the God of abundance, who offers to us abundantly resources beyond our imagination. And I'm not just talking about financial resources, because as Simon was saying, yes, Africa has been expanding and growing in multiple ways. And some of the most generous people are in Africa. Right? When they talk about actually the resources that they have, not just financial resources, but the way in which they share resources across their conferences in those places. Like when I've been there, they are very abundant in the gifts and in the offerings that they do have and that they do share with one another. In some places, I have, I have heard leaders in the African Central Conferences say, let us take care of our bishops. We can do this, right? And so it's also been a sort of a way of how do we begin to shift our thinking about God's abundance and the resources? Because I think too often our Western mentality is like, oh, we have to help them. We have to help the others who are in other countries. But yet both the Philippines, Africa, places in throughout Asia and in Europe, they do have an abundance of resources if we begin to think differently about how we allocate those resources across the world, right? And how we expect one another to utilize those resources for mission and ministry. That's why in 2012 and 16, we even added the Central Conference apportionments. Right? That's why they began giving to the General Administration Fund and the Episcopal Fund. That was a starting to say, oh, look, they do have resources if we begin to think about how those resources are allocated differently. So, if we are to think about a God of abundance, then I think we ought not be limited to the way we've always done it before. And we begin to think about what are the creative ways in which God is inviting us to look at all of the abundance of resources in a different kind of way. That's my theological opinion.
Okay, so you other two gentlemen, I'll give each of you a chance to speak along this line, but I'm going to inject some stuff here. So one is going to be when Simon is, I don't think it's helpful to just say people are saying. I think it's important to say what specific people are saying stuff. And so when Simon is saying that there are voices that are saying, hey, look, Americans kick in lots of money. We're not comfortable with non-Americans deciding where it goes. That specific voice that's saying that the loudest is Mark Holland, who heads up Mainstream UMC, and he's been very flatly saying that, and that's one of the reasons for regionalization that's being proposed. Now, with the conversation about abundance that Amy is raising, there is sort of this mindset that I'm familiar with is more in community resourcing. Whenever pastors do ministry in lower income areas, there's kind of this white knight complex that upper middle class people have, where, oh, because they don't have material resources like me, they really don't have anything to offer, and they are recipients of my charity. And that's a dehumanizing way to look at other people. And so there has to be an acknowledgement that even if there are regions of the world that are not monetarily wealthy, they do still have things to offer. And it would really quite be a shame if Americans looked at impoverished regions or developing regions like they really have nothing to offer. Even so, Americans do have already great abundance. And one of the things that I've wondered is, you have this 43% reduction of the budget that seems quite dramatic, but it's being done in the context where GCFA just released a report on general boards and agencies reserves, and the total number is $390 million of unrestricted net assets that could hypothetically be used to buttress the denomination, continue international mission and ministry, do all kinds of incredible things were they to decide to tap into those reserves. And then when you think about the reserves that are in annual conferences, that number probably doubles to between $600 and $800 million of unrestricted net assets that could be used at this time. And I was going to put it to Lonnie and Amy today. Both of you have talked about the need for a kind of constitutional convention where the whole denomination is sort of reworked. It seems to me that it might be in order to tap into these unrestricted net assets of the denomination to take the burden away from the local churches in this time of flux and get by on the blessings of previous generations to get through the present moment. I don't hear anybody talking about that, and that seems very strange to me, to cut down, especially on international mission, when it seems to me that the abundant resources are there, so not only to continue the mission, but also to provide these bishops that are very badly needed on the continent of Africa. So it seems strange to me that we're acting as though those really aren't realistic options when you've got almost $400 million sitting there that could be spent. So that's just me saying, I mean, that's kind of hillbilly logic maybe. But Joe and Lonnie, what do you think? Simon and Amy have already spoken a bit about this, but what do you think is helpful before we go on?
Well, getting back to your theology question, I guess my mind first went to the theology of the body of Christ, having many members and each playing a role. And the genius of the connection over the years has been, when it's been healthy, has been that it enables us to do together what we cannot do individually or as individual congregations. And if you think about the missionaries that have been sent around the world, you think about the institutions that have been founded, publishing houses and retirement communities and hospitals and the kinds of things that happen when the connection works together. That's the beauty of it when it's working well. I think part of the problem that we're facing, you mentioned about $390 million. Putting that in perspective, that's only like one quadrennium's worth of expenditures. So sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but that could disappear quickly over the course of not too many years if the reserves are there for a reason. I'm not saying they shouldn't be tapping into reserves, but if you spend it all, then it's gone. And but I think part of the structural stuff you mentioned, one of the problems I think we've had, to Amy's comments, is why churches haven't been as enthusiastic about giving, is there's been a disconnect. We've professionalized so many of these functions. So, for example, the Board of Global Ministries, many, many years ago, the missionaries all related directly to them. They didn't, they weren't relating to local congregations that they had in previous decades. And so some years ago, they began this idea of a covenant relationship so that local congregations could kind of get to know individual missionaries again and develop a relationship with them. I think the problem has been because these agencies, part of the structure of the church, they seem like these big bureaucratic things that are far away. People don't understand them. They don't feel a personal connection to them. And I think that is a disincentive to really support them enthusiastically. So I think those kind of structural changes are needed. Plus, the reality is that, institutions are like individuals. You don't change until you have to. And we're getting to a point where we have to, because the funding just isn't going to be there to support the current structure or the current ways of doing business. As Amy has said, we have to imagine other ways of doing business. So, but to me, the body language to me, that's a theological, biblical image that I think really celebrates what the connection is and can be again.
Lonnie, anything else?
A couple of reflections on your question that started this piece of the conversation, Jeffrey, about what's the theology of money here. Well, that's as deeply rooted in the church as any part of the church is rooted. I mean, Jesus said a whole lot more about money and its use than he did about almost any other subject, certainly than he did about human sexual relationships. And so we can't talk about the message that we receive from Christ without talking about responsible use of our money and how it is part of the life of the church. And your example, Jeffrey, I think is extremely important. It carried on into the next generation in the church with Paul's ministry. One of the most important things in terms of what he talks about, at least in his letters to Paul, was his urging the congregations that he was forming and working with there in Europe about their responsibility to support the poor, not just where they were, but back in Palestine, in Jerusalem in particular. And he was making an offering, making a collection everywhere he went, and to carry back for those poor folks in Jerusalem. And we have that legacy to work with in our church today. So yeah, we're on firm theological ground in seeing budgeting as a really important part of the work that the church does.
So the next question was going to be, what's at stake? And how about I just broadly put how I'm understanding the different options. One is the General Conference adopts the recommendation from GCFA and the connectional table, and you implement things as best as you can. Another option would be a lot of people get up and say, no, we absolutely cannot cut these services. We're going to have to dip into our financial reserves and start depleting some of those unrestricted net assets. And then the other scenario would be, hypothetically, people could say, no, the cut needs to be much more dramatic than 43%. We really need to just talk about closing down some of these general boards and agencies, combining them, and so in that event, you'd be looking at a reshuffling of the deck, I guess, or I don't know what that would look like. Do those all sound? Are there any other hypotheticals that could possibly happen next month when everybody's together?
Well, I think you've made a really good sort of broad summary of what the options are. But I think it's important to remember when we talk about using reserves that the church has at least two, maybe others as well, but mainly two sort of reserve funds. And these cash reserves, unrestricted cash reserves that we've kind of been talking about here, that GCFA has highlighted, what was it, $390 million?
Yeah.
Dollars. Those are cash reserves. But the general church and, of course, the local churches as well have huge reserves in real property. And in fact, some of our agencies have already started selling off properties and converting those funds to operating funds. Now, mind you, that in my judgment is a path to destruction. When you start living off your flesh, as it were, then sooner or later you eat up all your flesh. And so those are strictly, and as Joe pointed out, even the cash reserves would service as operating funds only for a limited period of time. So both those kinds of things are and should be seen as temporary measures. Those are not sustainable over a long period of time. The only thing we can do as a general church in terms of operating funds on a sustainable basis is live on what the local churches provide on an ongoing basis.
Well, and
yeah,
yeah,
you go ahead, Amy.
Well, and I kind of want to echo, there's two things that I want to come back to. Joe was talking about, sort of the need for change immediately, but I want to also remind us that I mean, even in 2012, the agencies and the programmatic bodies were already seeing some of the decline, right? Like some of the decline, and they had already been looking at how do we begin to reduce the size of our boards? How do we begin to reduce our staff? How do we begin to sort of restructure and reorganize to be sort of more lean and adaptable and able to kind of address some of those? So this has been happening over the last 10, 12, 15 plus years. This is, this is not new to that. But also to kind of speak to what Lonnie was talking about, I think that yes, and CT and GCFA told them to spend down their reserves, right? So there has already been this responsibility that has taken place by the general agencies to begin to spend down their reserves so that they weren't sitting on these large pots. And that's just the general agencies. Now, General Conference hasn't touched the annual conferences or the local churches' reserves or even the assets that they have. But this is all presuming, and this kind of comes back to your question, Jeffrey, that we would continue to do things the way we've always been doing them until we all of a sudden have nothing left. But again, if we're talking about a God of abundance, a God of creativity, a God of wonder who helps the body, the body of Christ continue to do mission and ministry, then it really is requiring everyone, especially delegates at General Conference, to think creatively about how we share our resources in a way that is abundant and that helps us look at mission and ministry differently. I know Lonnie said selling off the buildings and things like that may be like eating your flesh. Is that what you said, Lonnie? But again, what happened during COVID? Like all of these big, corporations realized that working from home shifted and changed. And I know some of them are coming back to saying, oh, we need to be back in buildings. But it required people to think differently about how we connect and how we meet together. Even before COVID, the connectional table was beginning to do Zoom board meetings. And that saved us nearly $50,000 in just travel for board members, right? And so, again, I think we are ripe for a place in which our God of abundance can show us how to do mission and ministry differently. And that, I think, is what General Conference needs to lean into, is to say, how can we do this differently? What are our creative outcomes for this? It may mean smaller physical board meetings, but more, online kinds of meetings and spaces. And more.
Part of my selfish interest in this conversation is just because I think the rhetoric used in this present moment sets a tone for the future, and I want to be a peacemaker. I think it very readily can be said, the only reason we're in this belt-tightening moment is because all the conservatives left, all the evangelicals left. If they had stuck with it, we could still have all this mission and ministry. Look how selfish they were, and now we just have to make do leaner. Nobody here is saying that, and I think that's great. But I think that's the sentiment that can easily prevail. And I'm more interested in this, what I've heard a couple people say, and it's been a change that's needed for a long time. I like what you're saying right now, Amy. We needed to revise how we did things anyway. Brick and mortar buildings are not as essential for doing ministry as they once were. There are a lot of ways in which time and energy and money can be used better, and that's absolutely the case. But also, there's this institutional mentality on the part of the denomination where, I mean, if you said in the local church what Joe said, heck, we have enough money to get by for 4 years, undesignated funds, but we're going to reduce our budget anyway. A lot of people would, I mean, if I did that in the local church, they would say, Jeffrey, that's crazy. Our job is not to just save enough money so we can go on indefinitely. Our job is to have the money, spend the money we have right now for God's glory and for the benefit of the poor around here. And so I think a lot of people are carrying this presupposition that the United Methodist Church must sustain forever. And so we cannot have this financial approach that gradually depletes or even quickly depletes resources because we have to keep this thing going forever. But I wonder if a faithful position is, whether or not the denomination goes on forever, while we're here, we're going to be faithful with what we've been entrusted. And I hope there is some of that boldness just to say, hey, we have a lot that we're working with right now, instead of this defensive position of just really decreasing things and getting by on less and less. What if we aggressively push? You know, I hear all this optimism on the part of a lot of people. The United Methodist Church has exactly what this world needs, and as we change, we're ministering to the culture better. What happens if you lean into that, throw a lot of your reserves and money into it, and then live into that abundance rather than that scarcity? That's the experiment that I think would be very interesting, rather than kind of the scarcity. Let's reduce everything and get by on less and less. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I resonate, unless it's not clear, with a lot of what you're saying in particular, Amy, because I think it really is sad when churches get in a defensive scarcity position. I don't think that's where Christ calls us. So I think I'm 100% with you there, actually. Anything else to be said on this before we look at the different constituencies and what they would say about the budget? Okay, let's look at the caucuses. You know, we're going to look at the caucuses, general boards and agencies, conferences, and bishops, and we're going to look at things from all of those angles and see how the budget is relevant to them. Of course, caucuses are not funded by the general budget; they wouldn't care for that reason. But is there any reason why caucuses would be invested in this conversation about what decisions are made next month about the budget?
Well, I think it is probably connected to some of like the ministry plans, the racial ethnic ministry plans, which many of the caucuses are very closely tied to as well, because it is the programmatic realm of the work that they're doing with specific sort of racial ethnic groups. So I think that though the caucuses would be concerned about any more reductions to those. And again, it's such a small part of the budget, and yet such an important element that has an impact in the racial ethnic communities across the U.S. in particular. And so I think that yes, they would care about any more reductions to those arenas and would probably speak to that.
And I think it's probably worth noting that if I've read some of this stuff correctly, so those plans like the Strengthening the Black Church, Asian American Language Ministry Plan, those are all part of the World Service Fund. While the World Service Fund overall is being cut by half, those particular funds, I think, have tiny reductions. They've tried to maintain them at current level, or as close to current levels as they could. And the deeper cuts are coming in other parts of that. Each of those 7 funds have a lot of smaller constituent parts as well.
Yeah, let's look at Lonnie's numbers. He compiled the numbers for each of the main 7 funds. The World Service Fund is going to be reduced by almost 50%, 49.7%. The Interdenominational Cooperation Fund is going to be reduced 72.1%. That's the biggest percentage reduction. Ministerial Education Fund is going to be reduced 47.8%. The Black College Fund is exact same, 47.8%. The Africa University Fund, exact same, 47.8%. I did not notice that. The Episcopal Fund is going to be reduced 15.2%, and the General Administration Fund is going to be reduced 27.5%. So the smallest reduction is with the bishops. The biggest reduction is with ecumenical dialogue. GCC, UIC, I think, would be the main body that corresponds with that. So let's talk about the general boards and agencies then. I don't think any have put out an official statement, but is there any, do any of y'all know anything about how the general boards and agencies are responding to, I mean, it's still kind of recent, like last week I think this article came out about these cuts. Is there kind of a sober, yeah, this probably needed to happen, or do you think there's going to be a push at General Conference for some of these general boards to say, no, hey, we really need more money?
My impression from the little I've seen is that they're kind of acknowledging the reality and they're going to have to adjust to it. I mean, because if at General Conference, the delegates vote to spend more, it's not going to find the money somewhere. And that's going to be a problem if it's, so I think this, and as Amy said, they've been on this track for a while. They've been making reductions. They've been bracing for these things, and they've been preparing for them.
Yeah, Lonnie.
It's not only that they've been on this track for a while, but in fact, the role of the connectional table is to involve the agencies in these conversations that led up to these proposals. So it's not only that they're not surprised by them, they were involved in creating this budget. So likely, if this budget were to be the proposal that the General Conference were to approve, there would not be pushback directly from the agencies. Now, mind you, there may be some pushback from some of the caucuses that have a vested interest in supporting pieces of this budget. And it's not unheard of that the agencies work with these caucuses. And so there may be some working together there to work on maybe shifting some of this money. I don't think there's going to be any pushback from the agencies on this total reduction of 43% overall. That's almost certainly a done deal if that's what comes to the General Conference. But that's just my forecast. Nobody's got a crystal ball.
So the next two were the conferences and the bishops, and these two are really quite connected because according to this recommendation, GCFA is recommending that the American bishops are reduced from like 39 to 30 or 32, and that the African bishops, they gain 2. This, of course, has implications so far as they've set aside the money for this, but they don't have the authority to decide how many bishops are in each given area. That's in the jurisdictional conferences. So with that in mind, what's to be said about the conferences and the bishops? Are we aware of any forces at play that would influence these decisions next month from either of those categories? Go ahead, Lonnie.
Yeah, that's one of the most important parts of this thing in my judgment. As you say, the General Council on Finance and Administration does not determine how many bishops any area is going to have. Now, I'm going to focus primarily here on the United States because, again, that's where most of the money goes and comes from, for that matter, too. The number of bishops that is permitted in any jurisdiction is determined by the General Conference through a formula that's in our Book of Discipline. And only the General Conference can change that formula. However, every jurisdiction has authority to elect, of course, no more than the number that formula provides, but it doesn't have to elect that many. It can have a number of bishops that is lower than that, but not higher. And we've had some of the jurisdictions already have said that because of the number of mandatory retirements that are coming, they have authority to elect a certain number of bishops to bring them up to their allocated number. But they're not going to do that. I think Southeastern jurisdictions said that, and South Central. There may be others, I don't know for sure. Maybe North Central, I don't know. But the Western jurisdiction, the Committee on Episcopacy is going to be recommending, we know this for sure, to the Western jurisdiction that it elect 2 to replace the 2 who are facing mandatory retirement, Minerva Carcaño and Karen Olivito. So that would bring it up to the total of 5 active bishops that's permitted according to the formula. However, what we have to remember is that even though GCFA, General Council and Financial Administration, doesn't have authority to say, this is how many bishops you ought to elect, what they've done, and this is important, they've allocated to the Episcopal Fund an amount that would cover only the number of active bishops who would be serving if no jurisdiction had any elections to fill vacancies that will be created by mandatory retirements. So that's kind of a backdoor, it seems to me, recommendation about how many bishops each jurisdiction ought to have. And that's however many are serving right now with the number going away of those who retire according to mandatory retirement.
Well, that gets back to the issue of, General Conference can make decisions on what it would like to do. Jurisdictions can make decisions on what it would like to do, but you still have to fund them. And that's the problem.
Exactly.
I think the number of bishops currently serving in the U.S. is 39, I believe, and there are 7 mandatory retirements coming up. And so that would bring the number down to 32. And I think that's the number that they've allocated to fund. Now,
That they thought they funded. Yeah, that's
the
right.
GCFA actually wanted to reduce the number of American bishops to 22, but the Council of Bishops pushed back and said, we can't do that. You got to give us time to redraw boundaries and reallocate where bishops are serving, because they just needed some, I think we need a runway, they said, to be able to make those transitions happen. The Northeast jurisdiction, of which I'm a part, they've not made any public declaration of what they're planning to do. But my suspicion is they're probably going to follow suit and not elect any new ones. Right now, we're already several active bishops short. We have a retiree serving in New England. We have central Pennsylvania being covered by several bishops from other areas. So I think you're going to see more of those kind of creative arrangements, because bishops are expensive and there simply isn't going to be the funding for them.
And I think what you said too, Joe, is that they need time to redraw the lines, right? To figure out where what we have is what we will have to move forward. And then that will help us kind of say, well, what within this area, this region, what really will work. And that's what they're trying to do in the Southeast jurisdiction as well, right? Is to kind of look at all of the area and begin to think, okay, what is it that we have and who could serve together annual conference like, and begin to help us think differently about this.
Simon, I wanted to ask you directly and transition into our last part, which is just, how people should be thinking about this stuff, looking at this stuff. You are tied to the WCA. Does the WCA have any official stance on what it's hoping for the budgeting to do?
No, that's right. No, WCA is not touching on all those areas. WCA is just focusing on the issue of fairness and justice in terms of disaffiliations. What is fair for some should be fair for all. So they are looking at supporting the submissions done by the Africans on the disaffiliation petitions, so that at least there's fairness, so that every church is given the opportunity to determine where they want to be. They are not interested. They are not touching on those issues on budgets.
So, and then with so many of the issues we've talked about, there really is some contention with different ideas about what should happen. But after having this conversation, the impression I get is that there really aren't any other serious counter proposals for what is going to be done. It seems to me like there's already kind of a consensus opinion that what the GCFA and CT has recommended is probably the sober approach. And whether you lean left or right, liberal or conservative, everyone is probably going to be in a consensus opinion that this should be adopted next month. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to expect?
Yeah, I do agree with you. That's for me. That's what's fairly reasonable to expect it that way. That's how I would look at it as well.
And I think
everybody.
Well, I was going to say, and I think just historically, that's what General Conference has done, right? Like Lonnie and I may be both proponents for this constitutional conference, but historically, General Conference has sort of played the safe game, right? Like we're going to keep doing what is safe because we don't want to completely disrupt all that we have built. And that's the way General Conference has been historically. Now, is that my opinion? I may have other thoughts about that, but again, kind of leaning into the need for creativity and abundance, I would ask that the General Conference delegates be open, at least be open enough to hear what possibilities might arise that would help us think differently for the trajectory of mission and ministry into the future through the United Methodist Church. That's the only thing I would ask.
Yeah, it's hard to be proactive whenever you're in a defensive mode. So I think that's wisdom. Lonnie, you had your finger up.
I do see one weakness here that I wish we could get around. I'm fearful that it won't happen, but I'd like to see it. I think that this budget doesn't allow for enough attention on what could be done differently within the general agencies. I believe that we have too many agencies doing too much duplicative work, and that we could streamline that and even make a further reduction in the budget than has been called for in this proposal coming from GCFA.
Look at you, Lonnie. Yeah, was it the Towers-Watson report that was at the 2012 General Conference that was adopted to streamline, and then the Judicial Council ruled that it was no good for some reason? This is all vague to me, but it seems to me that this conversation has already been had and it failed.
That's true. That doesn't mean it will always fail, because it failed before, but yes.
Okay. Well, it's kind of fun having a conversation where there is kind of a consensus opinion. I mean, it sounds like there's room to push in different areas, but even so, it's kind of nice to talk about something where we don't think people are going to be screaming at each other about it in a month. So this has been kind of nice, y'all. Any closing thoughts before we end today's segment? We got it all out. That's great. Okay. Well, next week on the tentative schedule, we're talking about restructuring the general boards and agencies, but I don't know that much is on the table there. So if there's an alternative subject that we should discuss, we'll talk about it this week. But friends, we thank you for joining us. And if you're not already, go ahead and subscribe wherever you're listening to or viewing us. And make sure to share this with pertinent people. And we enjoy all the engagement. So if you got thoughts or comments, you can email me at plainspokenpod@gmail.com. Or you can just comment wherever you're listening to or viewing this. So we're going to cut things off. God bless you. We'll see you next week.